Today we're looking at some outright unbelievable, yet completely true, stories about one of the most legendary bombers of World War II, the B-17 Flying Fortress. At a time when nearly half of all bomber crewmen became casualties, falling out of the sky was just part of the job description, and horror stories were never in short supply. Let's begin. Before diving into the stories, let's first set the stage for how the bombing campaign worked and why it was so dangerous. A B-17 bomber was America's aerial sledgehammer against Nazi Germany. What earned it the name Flying Fortress was its bristling armament. Later models carried up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, resembling a porcupine with anger issues. The B-17G, considered the definitive variant, mounted guns in the nose, chin, dorsal, waist, ball turret, and tail positions, creating overlapping fields of fire in every direction. And you may be wondering why so many guns were needed, and why, despite them, so many bombers were still destroyed. Well, you can thank the German anti-aircraft defenses for that. While the British RAF preferred bombing under cover of night, American commanders believed their bombers, flying in tight formations with mutually supporting fields of fire, could punch through German defenses in broad daylight. This would allow them to strike with remarkable precision. They were half right. In practice, every fourth bomber was lost, every second crewman was killed, and only about 20% of the bombs hit their intended targets. Fighter attacks were the greatest danger early in the war, which explains the sheer number of guns on board. But once the long-range P-51 Mustang arrived to escort the formations, the bombers finally received much-needed protection against the Luftwaffe. Flak, however, was unavoidable and impossible to fight back against. The Germans ringed their high-valued targets with 88 mm and 105 mm anti-aircraft guns, deployed in batteries of dozens or even hundreds. And they weren't just firing randomly into the sky, hoping for a lucky hit. These guns were coordinated by radar and fire control systems that calculated exactly where the bombers would be. When a B-17 formation approached a target, the sky ahead suddenly erupted in black puffs of smoke. A direct hit could obliterate an aircraft instantly, while near misses shredded aluminum skin, fuel tanks, and control cables, and of course crewmen. Protocol demanded that bombers fly in tight formation. No evasive action, no deviation. The bombardier needed a steady platform to drop the payload accurately. In those moments there was nothing to do but fly straight and hope for the best. You'd watch a nearby bomber take a hit, trail smoke, then spiral downwards. You'd hope to see parachutes, but most often there were none. After releasing their bombs, formations would break and head back toward base, though many never made it. Yet the B-17 could absorb terrifying levels of punishment and still remain airborne, truly living up to its name. It became almost commonplace to see fortresses limping home with engines ablaze, entire sections blown away, or gaping holes ripped through their fuselages. With that in mind, let's begin with the story of a B-17 that came back in two pieces, literally. On February 1st, 1943, a formation of B-17s took off from Biskra, Algeria, bound for German-occupied seaports in Tunisia. Among them was a fortress nicknamed All-American. After successfully dropping their bombs, the formation turned back for the 300-mile return journey. That's when two German Messerschmitt fighters staged a head-on attack. The B-17 gunners responded, downing the first fighter in flames. The second broke away, but its pilot was hit and lost control. What happened next defied physics, engineering, and common sense. The crippled fighter narrowly missed the waist gunner, but its wings sliced into the All-American's tail, nearly severing it completely from the fuselage. The tail gunner suddenly found himself trapped in what was essentially now a separate aircraft, connected only by a few strands of aluminum on one side and bits of the floor. From another fortress, Lieutenant Charles Cutforth snapped what would become one of the most jaw-dropping photographs of the air war, a flying fortress with its tail hanging by a thread, somehow still airborne. Two engines were out. The left horizontal stabilizer was gone, the left elevator missing. The rudder and vertical fin were mangled. Nearly every control cable to the tail section was severed. In aviation terms, the situation was completely hopeless. Yet by sheer miracle, the autopilot happened to be engaged at the moment of collision. Instead of relying on the severed cables, the pilots could still use the electrical wiring and servo motors to control the bomber. With these, they kept the aircraft stable while the tail twisted and swayed. The rest of the formation slowed down to protect their wounded comrade, watching in disbelief as the All-American refused to fall. Against all odds, it not only made it back but managed a safe landing with no serious injuries to the crew. The aircraft was even repaired and went on to fly missions until the end of the war. Speaking of impossible survival, what about falling out of the sky without a parachute? Believe it or not, it happened more than once. On January 3, 1943, during a massive raid over Saint-Nazaire, France, 20-year-old Alan McGee was crammed inside the ball turret of his B-17F, nicknamed Snap, Crackle, Pop. It was his 7th mission. As the bombers neared the target, the sky erupted in flak. A sudden blast knocked out an engine. Another hit tore the right wing apart. The bomber was fatally crippled, spiraling downward. From his cramped ball turret position, McGee scrambled to re-enter the fuselage. Because the turret was barely 4 feet wide, he couldn't wear his parachute inside. It had to be stowed in the fuselage. In an emergency, he'd have to rotate the turret, open the hatch, climb inside, grab his chute, strap it on, and then jump, all while the bomber burned or broke apart. McGee managed to get inside, but to his horror, he found his parachute had been shredded by shrapnel. As the fortress disintegrated at 20,000 feet, another explosion blasted McGee straight out of the aircraft with no chute. Free-falling from 4 miles up, he lost consciousness from the cold and lack of oxygen. Certain death awaited him. But by some impossible twist of fate, his body crashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station. The angled panels slowed his fall just enough. German soldiers found him barely alive with a broken arm and leg, head injuries, and 28 shrapnel wounds. Amazed he was still breathing, they rushed him to medical care. McGee spent 18 months as a prisoner of war before being liberated in 1945. He would live to the age of 84, carrying the scars and memories of that impossible day. But McGee wasn't alone in such fate. In November 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran, tail gunner aboard a B-17 named Ricky Ticky Tavy, was on a mission over Bremen. The formation was swarmed by fighters, and Moran's bomber took heavy hits, shot in both arms and suffering broken ribs. He also discovered his parachute had been shredded. Then disaster struck. A catastrophic blast severed the entire tail section clean off the fuselage. Moran suddenly found himself plummeting inside a detached tail, spinning at 20,000 feet. Tumbling at 100 feet per second, he made a desperate decision. Instead of fighting, he stopped struggling and accepted death. But fate intervened again. The tail section smashed into a tall pine tree, slowing the fall enough to keep him alive. German troops found him still breathing. With a crushed skull and severe injuries, his survival seemed impossible. Yet a Serbian doctor, himself a prisoner, treated Moran with the barest supplies and somehow saved his life. Moran endured 18 months in brutal POW camps before liberation. And Moran wasn't the only one. In January 1944, James Lacey, tail gunner on a B-17 called Skippy, collided with another fortress near Athens. Like Moran, he fell to earth inside a detached tail section. After what felt like an eternity, the tail crashed into trees, breaking his fall. Staggering from the wreckage, he realized in shock that the rest of the bomber was gone. He was later rescued by Greek Orthodox monks. Even for those with parachutes, bailout was fraught with danger. Crewmen had to squeeze through narrow hatches. In bulky gear, often from an aircraft spinning out of control, many were knocked unconscious or killed before even clearing the bomber. Of those shot down, only about 25% successfully bailed out and deployed their chutes. And if you think surviving without a parachute or flying without a tail with a height of B-17 miracles, think again. On October 15, 1944, over Cologne, a fortress nicknamed Lovely Julie was torn apart by flak. A direct hit obliterated its nose section. Staff Sergeant George Abbott was killed instantly, his body absorbing shrapnel that would have killed the cockpit crew. In the blast, the entire nose simply vanished, leaving a gaping hole. First, Lieutenant Lawrence Delancey suddenly found himself flying what was essentially an open-air convertible at 20,000 feet in -40-degree winds at 200 miles per hour. The instrument panel was shredded. No altimeter, no compass, no airspeed indicator. The oxygen system was destroyed, meaning the crew would suffocate within minutes at altitude. In this impossible situation, Delancey dove to lower altitude so the crew could breathe, but at the cost of making them easy prey for every German gun on the ground. Navigator Raymond Leary, having lost all maps and gear in the blast, had to guide them home across enemy territory. The crew sat exposed to freezing wind as they limped the dying aircraft onward. Certain they were living their final moments, they braced for the end. But Delancey wasn't finished. Against all odds, the Lovely Julie crossed the Channel and reached England. With no brakes and no flaps, Delancey somehow landed the mangled bomber, saving the crew and earning a Silver Star